I spent the better part of 3 decades convinced I understood fall. You clean up the garden, you pull the dead stuff, you maybe throw down some compost if you're feeling ambitious, and then you wait. That was the rhythm I knew. Rake, bag, wait. And every spring, without fail, I'd stand over those same beds wondering why the soil felt tired. Dense in places it shouldn't be, pale where it used to be dark. I'd add more fertilizer, more amendments, more of whatever the bag at the feed store was promising that season, and things would grow, but never quite the way I wanted them to. Never the way I'd see them growing on certain farms I'd pass on long drives through Lancaster County. Those farms always stopped me, not because of the equipment, which was minimal, or the irrigation systems, which didn't exist, but because of how alive the ground looked, dark and loose and almost breathing. And I didn't understand it for a long time. I just filed it away as something those families knew that I didn't. Turns out I was right about that. I just didn't know how right. It was a late October morning when things started to make sense. I was driving back from picking up some fencing supplies, taking the long way home through the back roads the way I like to do in fall when the light gets low and golden in the afternoon. I passed a farm I'd passed 100 times, and there was a man out in the field with a wheelbarrow and a long-handled tool I didn't immediately recognize. He wasn't planting. The season was over. But he was burying something, working row by row with the kind of unhurried intention that told me this wasn't a new practice for him. I slowed down, not enough to be strange about it, but enough to watch for a minute. The field behind him looked different from mine. Even in late October, with the crops gone, it looked rich. I drove home thinking about that wheelbarrow. I started asking questions that winter, and what I found changed how I think about soil, about fall, and about what it means to actually feed a garden rather than just plant in one. Here's what I came to understand. The Amish relationship with soil isn't really about farming, it's about permanence. These are families who think in generations, not seasons. When you plan to be on the same piece of ground for 100 years, you start to see soil as something you're borrowing, not consuming. That philosophy shapes everything: how they rotate, how they rest fields, how they handle the end of the season. And central to all of it is what happens in the fall. Specifically, what gets buried in the fall. Because they figured out, long before the science caught up, that the most important growing season isn't summer. It's the quiet season. The months when nothing appears to be happening above ground. That's when the real work gets done. That's when soil either rebuilds itself or doesn't. And whether it does depends almost entirely on what you've left it to work with. The thing being buried is plant material. But not just any plant material, and not in just any way. What I'm describing is a specific practice of trench composting, sometimes called pit composting, combined with a very deliberate choice of what organic material goes into those trenches. The Amish farms I've studied and visited don't compost in piles the way most gardeners do. They don't turn bins. They bury directly. And they do it in fall specifically because they understand something about soil biology that most modern gardeners have completely backwards. Here's the thing about a compost pile sitting on top of the ground in winter. It's cold. It's exposed. The microbial activity slows to almost nothing. You're basically putting your organic material in a holding pattern, waiting for spring to do the work. But when you bury that same material 6 to 8 inches down, below the frost line in most climates, you create an entirely different environment. The soil insulates. Temperatures underground stay far more stable than surface temperatures. Microbial activity doesn't stop. It continues at a slow, steady pace all winter long. By the time spring arrives, that buried material isn't raw anymore. It's been partially broken down. The nutrients have begun migrating into the surrounding soil. The worm population, which clusters around decomposing organic matter, has been working the zone all winter. You're not adding compost in spring. You're uncovering a transformation that already happened. Now, what goes into the trenches matters as much as the trenches themselves. And this is where the second part of the practice comes in, the part that took me longer to understand. It's not just kitchen scraps. It's not just pulled plant stalks. The Amish specifically prioritize three categories of material: nitrogen-rich green waste from the final harvest, carbon-rich brown material like straw or dried leaves, and one additional element that I'll come back to, because it's the one most people overlook, and it's the one that changes everything. The green and brown material ratio is roughly 1 part green to 3 parts brown. That's the standard composting ratio most people know, but here it's being applied underground in a confined trench, where the ratio has an even bigger effect. Too much green material in an enclosed trench and you get an anaerobic breakdown. It gets slimy and sulfurous and the biology goes wrong. The brown material buffers that. It creates air pockets. It slows the process down to the right pace. Think of it like the difference between a campfire that roars up and burns out in an hour, and one that's been laid properly and burns slow and even all evening. The brown material is what makes the underground process burn slow and even. The trenches themselves are specific. Not wide, about a foot across. Not shallow, the target depth is 8 to 10 inches, occasionally deeper in heavier clay soils where drainage is an issue. Length depends on the bed, but these aren't short trenches. You're looking at full-length runs through growing areas, not scattered pits. The material goes in loosely packed, never compressed. Compression is the enemy of the air pockets that make aerobic breakdown possible. Then a thin layer of finished compost or aged manure goes over the top of the buried material, no more than an inch, acting as an inoculant. It's seeding the trench with the microbial populations you want. Then you backfill with soil and that's it. No turning, no monitoring, no intervention. The ground does the rest. I've measured the soil above properly buried fall trenches in late March and compared it to adjacent untreated soil in the same bed, and the difference in texture and color is not subtle. The trench areas are visibly darker. The soil breaks apart differently in your hand. It has what old farmers call tilth, that crumbly, moist quality that can't be faked and can't be rushed. You either built it or you didn't. Here's why the science agrees with what tradition already knew. Soil microbial communities operate in cycles. The fall burial works because it catches those communities at a specific moment, right as they're preparing for the low-activity winter phase. You're essentially handing them a supply of food right before a long, quiet period. They don't shut off entirely. They metabolize slowly, steadily, through the cold months. The byproducts of that slow metabolism, organic acids, humic compounds, the physical fragmentation of plant material, are exactly what builds long-term soil structure. Humus, the stable organic matter that gives healthy soil its dark color and its water-holding capacity, doesn't form fast. It forms through repeated slow decomposition cycles. One fall burial doesn't transform your soil, but 3 years of fall burials in the same beds creates a compounding effect. The first year you notice a difference. The second year you stop having to water as often. The third year you start getting yields that make your neighbors ask questions. I'd rather tell you that now than let you expect overnight magic. There isn't any. But there is something better than overnight magic, and that's a system that keeps improving on its own. The mistakes people make when they try this are pretty consistent. The first is burying material that's too fresh and too green, whole vegetable plants pulled right out of the ground with soil still on the roots, wet and dense. That goes anaerobic fast underground. Chop it first. Let it wilt for 2 or 3 days before it goes in the trench. Even a short wilt period changes how it breaks down. The second mistake is going too shallow. 6 inches feels like enough. It isn't. Below 8 inches is where you want the bulk of the material, because that's where soil temperature stays stable, where worm populations are active in winter, and where the material won't heave back toward the surface when the ground cycles between freeze and thaw. People who dig shallow trenches often find their buried material in strange states come spring, partly frozen, partly exposed, attracting pests. Dig deep and you don't have those problems. The third mistake is burying diseased plant material. I want to be straight with you about this. Trench composting at home doesn't reach the sustained temperatures that kill pathogens the way a hot compost pile does. Don't put tomato plants that showed blight into a trench. Don't put anything you've pulled because it was sick. That material goes in the trash or a dedicated hot pile. Everything else healthy stalks, spent vines, overmature vegetables, wilted greens. All of it is fair game and all of it feeds the system. The fourth mistake, and this one is the one I made for years, is skipping the inoculant layer. Burying raw material without giving the soil biology a head start means the right microorganisms have to find their way to the trench on their own. They will, eventually. But a thin layer of aged compost or even finished worm castings placed directly on top of the buried material before you backfill cuts weeks off the process. You're introducing a concentrated population of the exact organisms you want. It costs almost nothing, and it makes a measurable difference in how quickly the breakdown progresses. If you have access to worm castings, even a small amount, use them here. A pound spread across the top of a 20-foot trench is enough. That's not a sales pitch for anything. That's just the most efficient use of a small resource. Now, the third element I mentioned earlier, the one beyond green waste and brown material that the Amish include and most people miss. It's wood. Specifically, small pieces of partially rotted or fresh-cut hardwood. Chips, small chunks, pieces no bigger than your fist. Not sawdust chunks. This is the part of the practice that connects to a method some people have heard of called Hugelkultur, which is the German and Austrian tradition of burying wood beneath growing beds. The Amish version isn't Hugelkultur exactly. It's smaller scale and integrated into annual practice rather than being a one-time raised bed construction. But the principle is the same. Wood buried underground acts as a slow-release sponge. As it breaks down, and hardwood breaks down slowly over years, it holds moisture, releases carbon gradually, and creates a subterranean habitat for fungal networks that plant roots actively seek out. Those fungal networks, mycorrhizal fungi specifically, extend the effective root zone of plants growing above them. A plant that's tapped into an active fungal network can access water and nutrients from a much wider area of soil than its roots alone could reach. You're not just feeding your soil. You're building an underground infrastructure that amplifies how your plants feed themselves. The Amish figured this out by watching what happened in forest edges, where trees had fallen and decomposed beneath the leaf litter. The soil there was always the best soil, always the darkest, the loosest, the most alive. They brought that observation into their fields. The science of mycorrhizal networks caught up about 40 years ago and confirmed what they'd been doing for generations was exactly right. When you put these elements together, the trench depth, the layering ratio, the wood component, the inoculant, you're not composting anymore in the traditional sense. You're building a below-ground ecosystem. You're creating conditions for biological activity that persists across seasons, that compounds over years, that works whether you're paying attention or not. That's the part that gets me every time I think about it. You do the work in October and November when the garden looks finished and most people have moved on to other things. You dig the trenches, you layer the material, you backfill, and then the soil takes over, through the frost and thaw of November, through the quiet of December and January, through the slow warming of February and March. By the time you're ready to plant, the work is done. Not by you, by the ground. I find something genuinely humbling about that. You set the table, and then you get out of the way. One last thing, and I almost didn't include this because it sounds too simple to matter. In the fall, before any of this goes in the ground, walk your beds. Don't skip this. Just walk them. Look for compaction. Press your heel into the soil in different spots and feel whether it gives. Look for the areas that drain slowly after rain and the areas that dry out too fast. Identify your worst beds, the ones where things never quite thrived this season, and prioritize those for your deepest trenches and your highest proportion of wood material. Don't treat every bed identically. Let the soil tell you where it's hungry. The beds that already perform well can get a lighter treatment. The ones that struggled need the most investment. This isn't complicated soil science, it's just paying attention. And paying attention in fall, when the season is over and there's less urgency, turns out to be the most productive gardening you can do all year. The Amish man I watched that October morning wasn't rushing. He was moving steadily, row by row, with a wheelbarrow and a tool and about 100 years of handed-down knowledge driving every step. That image has stayed with me, not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. It was just someone doing the quiet, unglamorous work that makes everything else possible. That's what fall is for. That's what's worth burying.